We keep hearing the Prime Minister, who in the past would have been very, very cautious about using some of the words he's used to describe Tory and Reform politicians, using the word racist. Is it all about pointing at Reform and saying these guys are nasty, these guys are weird, these guys are a dark and malign force in British politics? Now, is this the answer? Is this the answer to Labour's woes, to Labour's electoral woes? It's a real, real nightmare.
Westminster can breathe a sigh of relief this week. Steve is away, so is Caroline. Mummy and Daddy are on holiday for half term, and so it's just Patrick and I this week on the state of it. And as producer Ewan has said, when the cats are away, the mice come out to play. This is like making a homemade bong and having 30 people over to your house, except Patrick and I are going to offer you 100% legal, high-grade political chit-chat, and what a menu we have for you this half term. We're going to start with the aftermath of the Caerphilly by-election. We're going to tell you how Labour High Command intends to respond, and on that theme we've got a proper scoop for you as well. And then lastly, we're going to ask a simple question. Is Keir Starmer woke? Well, to address that, I've got Patrick not here in the studio, where I feel a little like Billy No Mates, but on the other end of a Zoom call. And Patrick, how are you?
Yeah, I'm beaming in from a ill-timed holiday, but you know, when you're as interested in British politics as we are, every holiday is ill-timed.
So we're going to start with the aftermath of that Caerphilly by-election, which serves our interests to overstate the implications of these things. But by-elections are sort of rare events in that they enable us to examine the state of things, the reality of opinion in a given geography or demography of the country. And without saying that what last week revealed was more than a snapshot, as a snapshot, it was pretty painful for the Labour Party. I mean, Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, there are essentially two narratives which seem contradictory but can be true at once, possibly are true at once. One is that this seat going to Plaid, Labour falling by double digits in its vote share, losing a seat that it's held since its creation, is bad news and a data point which illustrates the party's ongoing decline in what were previously its fiefdoms in industrial England and Wales. The other point is that in this era in which electorates are more sophisticated, more online, more literate than ever before, there's ample evidence of tactical voting among people who, in this instance, piled behind Plaid, but who principally, it seemed, were determined to lock Farage out. So there's sort of something for everybody and cause for optimism and also a fair amount of soul-searching in number 10.
Well, David Lammy, now, of course, Deputy Prime Minister as well as everything else, sort of somewhat bafflingly told the PLP, which is the weekly meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, great news, everyone. The Caerphilly result wasn't great, admittedly, but it does prove that people are willing to vote for a progressive party to stop reform. Now, obviously, it might not always be us, and in this instance, it was Plaid, but it's good news because reform are going to lose because of this new electoral dynamic. Now, you just have to think about Caerphilly, or look up Caerphilly brackets UK Parliament constituency or Welsh Parliament constituency on Wikipedia and look at the page for 2 minutes to consider what a strange argument that is, right? Because if you're thinking, tactical voting was a thing in Caerphilly, you would think, why wouldn't people vote tactically for the Labour Party? Because the Labour Party, last time this was contested, won it with 46% of the vote. Plaid were not really in contention. What it shows is just how unpopular the Labour Party is in Wales, first and foremost. And there's no way to put a positive gloss on that via tactical voting, because next May there are going to be Assembly elections in Wales, Welsh Parliament elections in Wales. And look, Labour won a percentage of the vote, 12% of the vote, 13% of the vote. That under the new proportional system in Wales, they could be, if that's replicated across the country, they might not win a single seat, or they'll win low single-digit seats in Wales, right? In the heartland of, I know this is a terrible cliche, in Labour's heartland. So, that's not really good news for the Labour Party in the Welsh specific context. in a sort of broader UK context, that actually tells you something that is just as worrying, which is if it is progressives versus reform, then, you know, Plaid, the Greens, the SNP, etc., parties that aren't the Labour Party might be the ones who progressives are willing to mobilise behind to defeat reform. Now, none of that is good news for the Labour Party, right? The sort of general observation about the new electoral dynamics you're talking about and the specifics as in what this means for Wales. And for reform, yes, they lost, but they won 36% of the vote.
Whatever the opposite of losing convincingly is, you're looking at a party which didn't exist basically a year ago, which is now plundering votes. And they seized, what was it in the end? It was sort of 12,000 votes out of nowhere, which you don't see often.
No, exactly. And look, let's not do reform spin for them. They lost and they wanted to win, and I think a lot of the people on that campaign expected to win. I spent the day in Caerphilly with Farage about 2.5 weeks ago, and the conversation he was having with reforms officials in Wales was, if we turn out 10,000, 11,000 people on the day, we should be able to do it. Now, they did turn out 12,000 people on the day. The problem is Plaid turned out, several thousand more is the problem for reform. And if actually you are finding that high turnout elections, this is 50% turnout in a Welsh Parliament by-election. It's quite impressive. And reform's expectation was, okay, if turnout is higher than we expect, we're turning out people who don't usually vote. Actually, it turned out that Plaid were turning out people who wouldn't have voted, but were really motivated to give Farage kicking and send Farage home, which indeed they did on the Thursday night. But look, it tells you fundamentally, though, that if Reform are winning 36% of the vote in actual elections, then the polls are right. Then the polls might be understating Reform. Now, there's a big live strategic question, and we'll get onto this a little bit later when we discuss Keir Starmer's wokeness or lack thereof. The big discussion about whether Reform can grow from, the mid to high 30s to sort of, the really high 30s and the low 40s in terms of their polling. But it tells you that actually the polls are right and that there is a solid third or 35% of the country who want to vote Reform. And everything in British politics now is about how the left, the liberal left of British politics, responds to that electoral dynamic. How's it turn more people out? What are the messages it uses? How's it motivate its voters to vote against them? So these are all massive questions for Labour in particular to respond to. How do you grapple with the fact that sort of 35% of voters who are backing Reform seem to be an immovable force in British politics? And at the bare minimum, you've got to beat that number. You've got to motivate progressives to back you. I think that's the game we're in now. And at Labour HQ, there's going to be a new man in charge of winning it, which is something we picked up in a flurry of activity before we recorded the podcast this morning. And Gabriel, this is your scoop. So who is the man handed this hospital pass of winning Labour elections in this era of fractious multi-party politics that they've so consistently been losing?
Well, just to lift the veil for a moment, obviously our podcast parents are richly sourced in Labour land, and we thought we couldn't disappoint today. So as you say, we were furiously WhatsApping and calling people this morning for any detail or disclosure that might constitute a capital S scoop. And we've learned that Spencer Livermore, a man very well known to Labour watchers, he was Gordon Brown's director of strategy. He ran Ed Miliband's 2015 election campaign, and he's now a minister in the Treasury, very much held in the highest esteem by Morgan McSweeney, became very close to him at the last election. He's being brought in as Labour's national campaign coordinator, which in non-Labour land vocabulary means that he will be the leader of Labour's national election campaigns come next May and will be responsible for coordinating strategy with Downing Street. So, what does this mean? Well, in straightforward terms, this role was last held by Pat McFadden. Before that, Shabana Mahmood. It is a role occupied by people who personify the politics of this project and are trusted by both Starmer and his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney. It is in and of itself evidence that Labour recognises the scale of the challenge it faces in May. Patrick was just outlining the stupidity, for want of a subtler word, of Labour being too comforted by the fact that Reform lost. Nigel Farage has characterised the elections next spring as the equivalent of the US midterms. It is going to be a massive national political stocktake, and Labour at the moment is cruising for a bruising. So this is an attempt to put big hitters in big jobs ahead of that contest. There's another thing I'd say as well in terms of what it means politically, which is Wes Streeting has himself made the comparison to the Hartlepool by-election. Last week he said that the Caerphilly would be its own equivalent of that significant defeat suffered by Labour in May 2021, which Starmer used as a pretext to go harder and faster and sharpen his political direction. Wes Streeting says, by that same token, Starmer is going to learn from this. He's going to use it as, fire in his belly to intensify his political project and his desire to solve immigration and restore public services. I think if we are just to pan back to that moment, May 2021, where Starmer came within inches of resigning, Patrick and I both very vividly remember the debate running within the Labour leader's office at the time. There are some people who were advocates of the Rainbow Coalition Kumbaya philosophy. People use that defeat to make the case for Starmer to bring Corbyn in back from the cold, to do something to demonstrate his desire for unity, and to create a sort of broad church within the Labour Party, say things to bring the soft left back in, and essentially to sort of end this purge of the part of the political project's adversaries. And you had Morgan McSweeney, who adopted the diametric opposite to that. He was saying, change Labour, change Britain, let's engage in performative conflict, let's pursue the people that have left the Labour Party over the course of the last few elections and cease to prioritise what makes the Parliamentary Labour Party feel good about itself. Well, I suppose in Labour land, the more that changes, the more that stays the same. And it does feel, without being too reductive, Patrick, that there are some analogies in that after Caerphilly, there are those saying that the result shows the only viable course is to unite the left, unite the progressive vote, make Starmer less unpalatable to people on our progressive flank. And then there are those in and around number 10 whose core conviction remains that the path to number 10 last time was paved through places and people that Labour had lost, in particular Tory to Labour switchers. And we can't just ignore the fact, as you outlined, that Reform now is on 30%, consistently. And you talked about Caerphilly, but is ahead of Labour Party in national polls. And we can't just turn inwards and go to our comfort zone of Milibandism and soft leftism if we are to reckon with the political situation in front of us.
Yeah, this is the key strategic debate, and it'll be very interesting to see where Spencer Livermore lands, because obviously he worked for Gordon Brown, actually working for Gordon Brown, most famous for not delivering an election in the autumn of 2007 when Gordon Brown could have won it. There was a memo from Spencer Livermore gathering dust on Gordon Brown's desk, and it was only discovered until it was wasn't discovered until it was too late, sadly, and the rest is history. And obviously, Ed Miliband's 2015 campaign, actually, in the lifetime of that campaign, quite a lively campaign. Ed Miliband's numbers went up. Personal numbers went up, Labour's overall numbers went down. So it'd be very interesting to see where Spencer Livermore lands on this big strategic question. I don't think anyone who sat through budget meetings with Spencer Livermore in the Treasury would necessarily say he's a Milibandite, as the Labour right popularly understand that term. But this is the big question that's facing the Labour Party. Now, how does the Labour Party win this? This is the sort of essay question Spencer Livermore is going to have to answer. And we've been talking about Morgan McSweeney, but so let's mention the old Irish joke about asking for directions in the middle of the countryside. You wouldn't start from here. And it's a real nightmare trying to work out what the right course of action is. It's clear, as you mentioned, that in Downing Street, Keir Starmer feels like part of the answer is just speaking from the heart and using the R word, which he did again this week when Sarah Pochin, the Reform MP for Runcorn and Helsby, appeared on Talk TV and said the sight of black and Asian people on television adverts drove her mad. Now, she subsequently apologized for that and was saying she was making a point about DEI in the advertising industry. But Nigel Farage was absolutely furious about those comments. And you see why, rather, from Keir Starmer's response, which was to come out again and say reform were racist. Wes Streeting, who's been very assertive in adopting some of these positions and some of this language himself, trying to audition to be a standard bearer for a alliance of Blairites and the soft left, perhaps, coming out and using the racist word as well. Now, is this the answer? Is this the answer to Labour's woes, to Labour's electoral woes? Is it all about pointing at reform and saying these guys are nasty, these guys are weird, these guys are a dark and malign force in British politics, and you might not like us, but we're willing to call a spade a spade? Keir Starmer also did this with Katie Lamb, who gave an interview to our colleague Josh Glancy on the Sunday Times last week. Rising Tory star Katie Lamb was talking about deporting people who already have indefinite leave to remain. Keir Starmer, again, using very morally unambiguous, unequivocal language to basically condemn comments by Tory and Reform politicians as racist. Indeed, he looked very emotional as he spoke about the Katie Lamb stuff. So we keep hearing the Prime Minister, who in the past would have equivocated, he would have triangulated, he would have been very, very cautious about using some of the words he's used to describe Tory and Reform politicians and their policy positions recently, speaking with that kind of moral clarity, condemning very easily, using the word racist. Now, Labour politicians in particular, particularly on immigration, have run a million miles from that sort of language and style of communicating in the past. But this is Keir Starmer's meat and bread. And this seems to be, by accident or design, I think it's now by design, even if it was initially an accident, Labour's new strategy.
When the history of this period is written, and we might end up attempting to produce a reasonable first draft, I think that a lot of people will say a seminal moment inside Downing Street was when Starmer distanced himself from his previous assertion that Britain risked becoming an island of strangers. We've spoken to people in Downing Street about this before, and they've said that it was sort of so extraordinary in that it's so rare that a Prime Minister would disavow something they had themselves said, but also demonstrated the extent to which Starmer is just naturally not comfortable using that kind of vocabulary. In this instance, it happened to have echoes of Enoch Powell, but Starmer is never in his comfort position talking about the risks of multiculturalism, the extent to which Britain doesn't resemble its prior self. Now, what in strategic terms did that pronouncement amount to? Well, essentially, it was an example of Keir being Keir. You get the feeling, we get to get the fact of this period in history is that there's been a coming together of a candidate and a machine, an individual, a person in Keir Starmer, and then a politics and a tradition, a tendency in McSweeney and his Blue Labour adjacent philosophy. Well, this was that sort of alliance, even for a moment, coming asunder. And the question then was, will Keir lean into being Keir more? And conference was a fascinating flashpoint because he used his pulpit as a moment to address the public and the party membership directly in order to describe Reform's policies on indefinite leave to remain as racist. And he made homilies to progressive, diverse Britain. We've used this phrase before, the country of cutting the oranges at half time. That was his shining city on a hill, a country of people, getting on, piling in together, slaps on the back, being nice, solidarity. And he essentially contrasted that with the dark and, as you outlined, Patrick, sort of morally unacceptable position advanced by Reform. And it seems now like we're getting more of that Keir, the way he got on the front foot condemning poaching. I should say the sort of commentariat and political world reacted pretty ambivalently to his attempt to characterise reforms policy on definite leave to remain as racist, not least because it bears such resemblance to the sort of spirit and up to a point the letter of Shabana Mahmood's own position. But it's fascinating to see him pressing the R button again. And it does pose a question, which we were reflecting on earlier. And here we ought to credit Sam Coates, who is better than anybody at preempting where conversation in Westminster is going to turn and observing the undercurrents. And he was saying, well, is there any universe in which the number 10 operation stays as is and Morgan McSweeney stays in the current role of Chief of Staff if Starmer's attempt to resolve the strategic challenge posed by reform is to consistently accuse it of racist? I just want to mention one point before handing over to Patrick, which is Maurice Glassman, the Labour peer who is sort of architect of Blue Labour, was so appalled by Starmer's description of Farage's policy that he personally spoke to Farage and apologised and said that it is dishonourable and a betrayal of the noble traditions of the Labour movement to have said that. Now, Glassman and McSweeney are not the same thing, but their politics are closely related and they share an underlying critique of the effect of globalisation and mass migration on the country. How long can the man whose existence and political story has been about disavowing the sort of third sector, lanyard class, progressive tendency within Labour, how long does he stay if his own boss is constantly oxygenating the idea that you can win against reform on the basis, to coin a phrase, they're a basket of deplorables and racists?
It's a really, really interesting question, isn't it? Because it exposes so much that is unsettled about this government, about this prime minister, and about the direction it wants to take. I think the key point you made there, Gabriel, was you have the prime minister and increasingly cabinet ministers coming out and using the R word, saying reform are racist. This thing they've said is racist. Their policy on X is racist. Well, at the same time, so much of the government's bandwidth, the Home Office's bandwidth, is spent in service of the same politics, or not the same politics, but acknowledging that actually reforms policy positions are reflections of deep public discontent with the way the immigration system in particular is working, right? So we're speaking in the week where there's a new flurry of activity in government. This was reported in the Times by our colleague Matt Dathan, where Shabana Mahmood is furious at the use of hotels. Keir Starmer wants them all shut in a year, and they want to house asylum seekers on disused military bases. Now, if Nigel Farage came out and said that tomorrow, what do you expect Keir Starmer would say about it? You know, Nigel Farage saying, let's put migrants in camps on RAF bases. I think actually the gut reaction of lots of the PLP would be to say it has quite dark historical connotations. Now, that's actually the stated policy of the government, right? So, you know, there's this growing gap between the sort of aesthetics of what the government wants to talk about and the reality of its policy, which I think is just storing up loads of problems to start with, particularly of Labour's electoral policy now is let's try and motivate progressives behind us. Actually, if you're a sort of progressive who's annoyed at the Labour Party for not being progressive enough, and you're not an idiot, right? Keir Starmer coming out and saying that's racist. If you are a sort of high-ish to mid-information progressive voter, you know, you'll have a Zach Polanski TikTok in which the leader of the Green Party says, you know, refugees welcome, you know, I hate billionaires, etc. Or you're aware of what the government has been doing on a range of other issues, apart from using the word racist a lot. So that's a big live question. It's pretty incoherent strategically. And yeah, this does raise the question that you've just raised, and it's one of the most delicious in Labour Party politics. You know, what does this mean for Morgan McSweeney and what we might call McSweeneyism? Now, having written one of the histories of this period, Gabriel, you and I know that you always lose money betting on a breach between Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney, because Keir Starmer has only ever done this, which is to say, thought about leading the Labour Party, led the Labour Party, and been Prime Minister with Morgan McSweeney at his side. But this big sort of strategic call they're now making is one that raises a question about what is Morgan McSweeney in this age of politics, because it's clear that the electoral system or the electoral dynamics have maybe moved on from, the 2021 to 2024 landscape. It's a different kettle of fish. It's not about beating the Tories. It's about beating reform. Yes, it's not necessarily incompatible to say, look, we'll sound progressive, but deliver on the issues that are driving reform support. It's a big, big if. But it does make you ask, what is Morgan McSweeney doing inside Number 10? What does his job look like now? And that's a conversation we've been having with people,
Definitely.
isn't it? And, someone used a brilliant metaphor or analogy to describe where Morgan McSweeney fits in, which I'll let you explain because it's actually quite beautiful and moving.
It was a really astute piece of political analysis from our source, who said that the way Starmer thinks about politics is akin to a machine. When you get all the cogs turning, then it just works. And there are lots of cogs. There's policy, there's communications, there's structure and configuration of Whitehall, and then there's politics itself. Now, I thought that was so revealing because the fact that politics is just one of the many cogs in the Swiss watch rather than the device itself, well, that tells you something. Starmer has always subcontracted politics to McSweeney. What does that mean when you're in government, when all of government and governance has to be suffused with politics in order for the public to understand what it is that your argument is and what it is that you're trying to do? I spoke to somebody earlier, I should say, and I put this question to them. And I mentioned the fact that if you look at the original political team within Downing Street, it has to a large part disintegrated. Paul Ovenden, McSweeney's right-hand man, was director of strategy. He's recently left. Steph Driver, director of communications. She's gone too. I don't want to speak too much about names which are of greater interest in Westminster than they might be outside the postcode of SW1, but Megan McCann, a very highly rated political operative who was in McSweeney's team, I've just learned is on her way to the Whip's office to form a kind of beefed up political presence there. And I said, well, what does that show about the direction of travel within Downing Street? Where does that leave Morgan? And I might just get out my phone because I transcribed it as this person said it. It was a really interesting response. They said that Morgan is our last line of defence. They didn't rule out the idea that there could be an orderly transition in and around May. At some point next year, could Morgan go back to Labour Party headquarters to prepare for the next general election, which is what he did in 2021, left Parliament in order to go to Labour HQ. But they said that it is nonsense to say that he's going to walk out. And they repeated an idea which has been put to us more than once, which is that it's a contradiction in terms to say he would leave. He is this project made flesh, and almost enjoys parity of esteem in the eyes of Labour MPs and cabinet ministers to Starmer in terms of the political direction of this government. For him to leave now, for him to sort of wave the white flag when there are those who would recast this political project as opposition to Farage and racism, misunderstands this man's life's work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is one of the crucial things to remember. This is his project, arguably to a much greater extent than Keir Starmer's in terms of the electoral strategy. Now, at a moment where all of that is up in the air, where the core tenets of McSweeneyism, i.e. what progressive voters are obsessed with, or certainly progressive activists, and what Labour MPs are obsessed with, are the sort of things you should try and block your ears to, you should try and ignore. Those things have never been more contested. But Megan McCann going to the Whip's office is a prime example of that. Right, this is a government that is now at a number 10 that's now having to start listening to Labour MPs moaning, that's suddenly sort of consumed with existential dread over progressive voters and progressive activists turning to Zach Polanski, turning to the nationalist parties in Wales and Scotland, turning to Jeremy Corbyn, right? All of the things that they thought were settled and that they could ignore, those questions have returned with a vengeance. In Labour HQ, by the way, who's just arrived? Lucy Powell. We've been talking about Spencer Livermore, another former aide to Ed Miliband. Lucy Powell, who was Ed Miliband's chief of staff for a period, is now deputy leader of the Labour Party and has her own analysis that Labour hasn't been progressive enough. So do you think Morgan McSweeney is now going to say, you know what, fair enough, I'll let Lucy Powell run Labour HQ. All of my analysis turns out to have been wrong. I'm just going to kick back and relax. I mean, look, I don't think Morgan McSweeney is going to do that. There's never been a greater sort of level of jeopardy about the direction of the Labour Party. And ultimately, it's for Morgan McSweeney to try and win this argument. Now, who knows? Maybe he will win the argument and actually it'll turn out to be an electoral disaster for the Labour Party. Maybe Keir Starmer will make clear over a course of decisions he takes in the run-up to May that actually he has come to a different analysis, and Morgan McSweeney can do a bit of that politics, but he wants to do a very new woke brand of Starmerism as well and try to make them coexist, which I think, by the way, is what's happening right now, as we were discussing with the gap between policy and communications increasingly on questions of immigration in particular. But what's interesting is that Morgan McSweeney has clearly alighted on Spencer Livermore, not for the first time and probably not for the last time, as one of the people who can anchor Labour in something sensible, or at least split the difference between these two positions. When he was trying to get rid of Sue Gray, or when people around Morgan McSweeney were trying to get rid of Sue Gray, and Morgan McSweeney wasn't yet ready to take on the role of chief of staff himself or accept that he was going to have to do that, who did he tell aides? Who did he tell his colleagues that could be chief of staff to Keir Starmer? Spencer Livermore, who was in all the meetings ahead of the 2024 election. Spencer Livermore, who has been responsible for all the big fiscal decisions, who's been at Rachel Reeves' side, who's been engaging with business in the Treasury. Spencer Livermore. So yes, his is a name we might not hear that often, but from opposition to government, from the budget to the elections in May, the two big political events of the coming months, Spencer Livermore is going to be at the heart of them, and his is a name I think we're going to be hearing much, much more of.
We probably ought not to overstate the rigidity of McSweeney's politics as well, because, if you were to speak to those close to him after last year's general election, they were saying that, this next 6 months is going to be an exercise in masochism. We're going to make the PLP learn the hard way how much Labour's changed, winter fuel payments, welfare reforms, and McSweeney was front and centre of that. He was also intimately involved in the tactical and strategic retreat from both policies. So has Starmer gone woke? I think our combined wisdom is that for now he might have, but will he be allowed to remain woke? That might be the essential question of the political period following the budget, which no doubt we will be discussing next week when we will have Caroline and Steve back. Patrick and I will be here with you too. We'll all be in the studio, and I must end by thanking our superlative producer, Ewan Daughtry. He, as ever, has made us look good behind the scenes. We're very grateful to him, very grateful to our listeners, and we'll see you in a week.